I think that, yes, technology exposes all the terrible things about us and also all the amazing things about us as well. But it's important to always be critical and always to be looking at the other side of things and the unsaid things and the hidden things, which is what psychoanalysis is so great at doing, is unearthing all the terrible, scary things about humans, about culture, but also about ourselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Parton, and you are listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio. This week, our guest is philosopher and psychoanalytical theorist Isabel Millar, who recently released her book, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, in which she explores the much neglected role of enjoyment and psychoanalysis in the field of AI. Throughout the book, Isabel uses the sexbot as a vocal point of discussion, which allows her to emphasize the role of gender, sex, and a body as it relates to the deeper questions that AI is revealing to us about humanity. In this conversation, we explore these notions of Isabel's book, first by establishing an understanding of psychoanalysis, and then we go through themes such as the importance of the body, the role of the female artificial intelligence in film, and the cultural and philosophical importance of film, the dominance of men in the creation of AI, and ultimately what AI can teach us about ourselves. For fans of philosophy and psychoanalysis, I can't recommend this episode enough, as Isabel is obviously well versed on the subject. And for those of you who might be less familiar with these subjects, perhaps this conversation will spark your interest. So without further ado, everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Isabel Millar. Well, let's jump into the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence, which is the name of the book that you released in 2021. What was the motivation that made you want to write this book?
My initial background is philosophy and psychoanalysis. And so, I was already in the field of thinking about human subjectivity and what motivates our actions, and the question of being and thinking and enjoyment and all of these concepts, tricky concepts that come about through the study of psychoanalysis and philosophy together. And so when I first started my doctoral project, which this book was a product of, I first was interested in artificial intelligence because it seemed to me to be a field where there was so many sort of psychoanalytic and philosophical faux pas going on, as it were, that were just ripe for examination. And whilst I'd seen lots of kinds of partial treatments of things like, for example, as you brought up, the use of the female voice, or our obsession with certain forms of feminized technologies, this wasn't exactly my entry point. Mine was a little bit more, I suppose, structural, in a sense that I was interested in the relationship between psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence as two fields which intersect or have an extimate relationship to each other. Extimate is a term in psychoanalysis that means both inside and outside. But also extimate refers to the way that in psychoanalysis we think about the question of the unconscious. That the unconscious is something which is both inside, but more fundamentally outside, because it's structured by the language and the symbolic structures around us, the laws, the traditions, the history that make us act in certain ways. So there is a huge amount of sort of theoretical baggage to go into before I would begin to explain how the question started. I won't give you all the sort of philosophical backdrop because I don't know whether that's necessarily what you're interested in. But what I will say is that I first started asking the question about why artificial intelligence has not been properly theorized by philosophy. And then I started to realize that the philosophers who had looked into artificial intelligence were often not engaging with their position as psychoanalytic subjects within this field. So on the one hand, it's a sort of a disciplinary and methodological project that interrogates how to ask these questions. And on the other hand, it's a genuine kind of speculative foray into looking at the ways that our fantasies about artificial intelligence historically have grown into real, actual technology that exists, and how the relationship between fantasy and reality is part and parcel of artificial intelligence.
And what are some of those faux pas that you saw happening in the artificial intelligence space that psychoanalysis addresses? And to that point, could you just briefly kind of explain what psychoanalysis is as well, just for people who might not be fully familiar with the term?
Yeah. So the second thing you said was like the longest question that how long have you got to explain what psychoanalysis is? So first of all, I'll that probably take us the whole hour. So in terms of the question of how, philosophy, or philosophy is a very, very broad term. I'm using it in inverted commas because within philosophy you have very many different approaches, but in terms of the way that popular philosophy has often engaged with the field of AI, it takes for granted lots of questions about what artificial intelligence actually means. And, the fact that we have this idea of intelligence as if it's this gestalt of a human subject that is a fully formed, intelligent being that can then be replicated and ad infinitum, and then we have various different versions of this so-called human intelligence. So the first thing that I was interested in doing is looking at the concept of intelligence itself, never mind the artificial part, and analyzing how that idea has developed over time, the history and the genealogy of the concept, where it comes from philosophically, and looking into the different ways that today there are lots of sleights of hand that go on when we talk about AI, because obviously people within the field of AI know very well all of the distinctions between symbolic AI and neural networks, and the difference between trying to replicate a mind versus trying to replicate a brain. But for people outside of AI who hear all the stories about what AI is doing and just go, oh God, AI is coming and it's going to be scary and it's taking over, people within AI laugh because they think, well, but you don't really understand what we're talking about. And whilst, that is true, that there's lots of sort of misapprehensions about what is actually happening in the field of AI, it doesn't mean that actually in the field of AI, people in AI also aren't that self-reflective on what they're talking about when it comes to this future of the singularity and these fantastical ideas about the coming age of, when they all come to get us and rip us from our beds because we've been terrible humans. These kind of fantasies also exist within artificial intelligence. So part of the book as well was to kind of like explain what's actually happening in artificial intelligence and why there are some theoretical clarifications necessary. But even on that score, in terms of the conceptual basis to thinking about how intelligence relates to the question of knowledge and truth and the body, this is where it starts to become psychoanalytic, because psychoanalysis invokes the body in a way that's for philosophy has a sort of strange relationship as well. So there's a sort of difficulty when it comes to thinking about how we position truth and knowledge in relation to this supposed idea of a progression of intelligence, of an intelligent being becoming more and more intelligent. Because of course, within artificial intelligence, all that you really have is various different forms of intelligence that can be augmented and sort of accelerated, but you don't have a wholesale replication of a human mind. And so this kind of fantasy is one that obviously resides within our sort of sci-fi images of artificial intelligence, and one which has as its heart the kind of question of sexuality, which properly comes into the psychoanalysis of AI.
Yeah, you focus on the sexbot as kind of like a vehicle for exploring this conversation, and you were talking there about the importance of a body. So what is the importance of a body for an AI? What does it mean for an AI to be embodied? And does that automatically bring us into that realm where sex becomes something very important that we need to talk about in terms of how that AI functions in the world?
Well, again, I think I have to return to your previous second part of your question, because I don't think I actually addressed it, which is really the meat of the book, which is, you said, what is psychoanalysis? Well, psychoanalysis is a very strange and misunderstood field, which on the one hand is a clinical practice, and on the other hand, it's a philosophical endeavor and a attempt to theorize what the speaking sexed subject is. So in a sense, it's a challenge to some aspects of philosophy, in that it uses the idea of the unconscious, the idea of language, the idea of bodily enjoyment to problematize the supposedly self-evident kinds of knowledge that we have. And most people will be familiar with the Freudian idea of the unconscious, the Freudian idea of various different psychic structures, of neurosis, of psychosis, of perversion, these kinds of ideas that Freud has as his basis for the whole beginning of psychoanalysis. And Lacan, who is the thinker who I draw on predominantly in this book, this is a Lacanian version of psychoanalysis that I use, was a French psychoanalyst who, in the wake of Freud, started his own school of psychoanalysis. And it is, probably one of the most influential figures in intellectual history in the 20th century. His work has influenced not just the field of psychoanalysis, but philosophy, critical theory, feminist theory, art theory, political theory, you name it. People are still drawing on Lacan's work. And he enacted this return to Freud, where he went back to Freud's work and wanted to retrieve the radical and subversive kernel of what he saw as Freud's contribution to the field of psychoanalysis. And because what he thought was happening is that Freud was being interpreted in too much of a sort of assimilative way. Is that in American ego psychology, for example, was taking Freud's insights and making them into sort of therapeutic kinds of psychologizing ways of making human beings fit into society. Whereas what Freud had done was to intervene at the most rudimentary level of human subjectivity, to ask questions about how do we form our idea of ourselves? What is sexuality? How do children negotiate their relationship between their parents? How do they negotiate entrance into language? How is the body made up of all of these different drives that make us behave in certain ways? And these ideas for Lacan were so important that they had to be re-examined. And what he did to re-examine them was to use the sciences of his day, like structural anthropology, Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology, Saussure's linguistics, and of course philosophy and literature and other resources that he had to really think about the Freudian edifice and interpret it in a very sort of groundbreaking way. So this question of the body is fundamental for psychoanalysis. It's the body and language are the things that we have to think about when we're talking about subjectivity. So of course you can see there are all these concepts that when you start to think about artificial intelligence from a psychoanalytic perspective, you realize that it's even more complicated than it first seems, because how can you replicate this idea of a body? What is a body? And so you can see that there's it's a sort of error to already think that we can imagine replicating versions of ourselves at this stage in our technological advancement.
Yeah, because once we embody the AI, we unlock all of those philosophical quandaries that you just pointed to, right? Which
exactly.
And one of those I think that you've emphasized specifically is that of enjoyment, and I think you referred to it in the book as jouissance, I believe is how what
Jouissance, yeah.
jouissance, yeah. What is it about that aspect of enjoyment that is really relevant to artificial intelligences or embodied AI?
Well, now that again is a very kind of long-winded question in the book, because jouissance is a concept in psychoanalysis that has a sort of very long theoretical journey. It starts off with Freud, with the idea of libido, but of course it takes various different conceptual turns, and Lacan ultimately thinks about jouissance as what comes about via the incompleteness of knowledge, the inconsistency of knowledge, and the impossibility of forming a whole consistent idea of oneself via language. And that sounds like, what the hell does that even mean? And that's because that's what it's designed to do, is to make you have to sort of unpack what something that seems so self-evident as enjoyment. Oh, that's enjoyment. We all know what that is, but actually is the most complicated and the most human and the most strange concept that we can imagine. And in fact, the one fundamental thing that distinguishes humans from virtually everything else in the universe. So this question of enjoyment is one which goes through, as I say, various different twists and turns, and there are different ways that you can use it. But essentially, what Lacan ends up with is talking about the idea of two different forms of enjoyment, which don't take this the wrong way, because people think that this is something to do with men and women, and it's not really, but they're called phallic and other, or feminine enjoyment. And men and women can both use and employ and experience these forms of enjoyment, and there are many infights within the Lacanian field about what that means, but essentially what it means is there is a certain form of positioning within language that you will be subject to, which means that you are experience a feminine or a masculine form of enjoyment. But again, this does not just apply to human experience, it applies to a sort of more abstract level in which we can imagine talking about enjoyment on a sort of societal or political level. So the question of artificial intelligence is one which is also characterized by these forms of enjoyment, and they are, the creation of artificial intelligence is also responding to these kinds of impasses and these kinds of questions about what it is to be a human being. And essentially this difference between masculinity and femininity here, crucially for psychoanalysis, unlike most other ways of interpreting it, is not about two binaries, it's about two failed versions of subjectivity. So masculinity and femininity are both failed versions of trying to become a whole, and neither of them are. And that's because of language is inherently structurally incomplete. We can never express everything through language that we want to. And we are castrated by the symbolic, which enacts this sort of violence upon this libidinal vortex that we are as biological entities. So that's the simplest way that I can explain what jouissance is. So it does a lot of work in the book. It does a lot of hard work in the book. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to create an artificial intelligence that won't have to address these issues? What is the need to resolve these issues, I guess, is my question, because couldn't we create an AI that is embodied, that doesn't need to think about these I guess these gendered aspects or some of these deeper philosophical things? Couldn't we program it maybe in such a way that it can be ignored?
Of course we can, and that's what
Yeah.
people are doing. And it's not really the question of whether we can or we can't. It's more the question of what does it make us think about when we interrogate AI from this perspective? Because when we have these fantasies about artificially intelligent beings, what's happening is that we are we're talking about ourselves most of the time. We're talking about things that we don't already understand about being human. And that's why it's very fascinating to see how these sort of fantasies reside in, for example, science fiction film, and how you can kind of identify the different forms of thinking that exist within fantasies about AI. And yes, we can create forms of AI, and people are creating forms of AI that don't have these problems. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? It's that we seem to have a very sort of rudimentary idea of what this strange thing of human thinking is. And it's right now still quite staggering that within the field of AI, there is so little sort of theoretical engagement with questions such as how is the concept of intelligence related to self-consciousness. And I would, from my perspective, say that the field of AI is mostly dominated by people from the sort of analytic philosophical tradition, and not so much the continental philosophical tradition, which takes a very different view of this strange creature, the human being. And in the analytic tradition, it's fits more easily in the positivistic mathematical sciences, and therefore is not really so much concerned with these annoying questions of, like bodies and stuff. What's that? What's reproduction? Where did we come from? Who cares? These kinds of big questions that can't be answered, which is what psychoanalysis asks. They're impossible questions.
Yeah. Do you think this is the result, perhaps, of what is very arguably a male-dominated sphere? When I think of people who are really creating technology and talking about the most, obviously we think of Ray Kurzweil, who, founded Singularity. We think of Elon Musk. We think of Bezos, and, a lot of very, it's a lot of masculine leadership that's driving the creation of technology. And even for that matter, creating the film, a lot of the writers and directors that create the movies like Her and Ex Machina, I believe are all men as well. So is there something to that the cultural narrative around technology is being driven by what I guess would be, the phallic energy, or maybe the masculine energy?
Absolutely, yeah. And completely, as well as in most of the sciences, that is the case. But particularly, I think AI is one that is very male dominated. And the whole idea of the female, recreating a female AI, I found really fascinating, because it's a way of immediately kind of dramatizing and staging this question of sexual difference and the sort of epistemological question of sexual difference, which is why I'm interested in the book. One of the films that I examine is Ex Machina, because it's a dramatization of the Turing test, which I'm sure most people listening to this will know that the Turing test was the sort of beginning of artificial intelligence. And that Alan Turing himself was a homosexual man who was chemically castrated because it was illegal at the time, and he killed himself. And one of the aspects of the Turing test that is often not talked about is the fact that it was, one of the things that it had to do was to fool an interlocutor into thinking that you were a different gender via the use of language. So it was called the imitation game. And this idea, superficially, it seems to be about gender, and it was. But if you look at the film Ex Machina, and you look at this relationship between the female sex robot or sexbot and the male interlocutor, Caleb, and he's sent to sort of find out whether she can pass the Turing test, and she does. And how does she? She does it by making him fall in love with her. And so through this kind of communication between these two entities, one human, one non-human, supposedly, this Turing test is enacted. But through it, what we're actually witnessing is a sort of staging of masculinity and femininity. He's asking her questions. He wants knowledge from her, and she is doing everything that she can to appease him and give him what he wants and seduce him and embroil him in this sort of game of seduction. And so we could say, oh, well, this is, this is just a sort of anti-feminist, sexist portrayal of a sexy young robot. But actually, there's something much more interesting going on, because she's actually sort of enacting this sort of feminine jouissance, this other jouissance, and he is stuck in the position, sort of traditional masculine position, of wanting this obscure object of his desire, which he can't really get, and he doesn't really understand. And she, on the other hand, we don't understand what she's thinking and what she's doing. And by the end of the film, she's escaped, and who knows what she'll do. But the fact is, she supposedly is an AI, but the roles are reversed by the end of the film, because she's put him in the position of the captive robot. She's outside in the world, she's discovering, she's becoming a human. So this kind of dramatization of the sort of sexual game, the sort of sexual relation, I think is very interesting to look at. And in the book, I go through various different films, examining in different ways the ways that psychoanalysis has a very interesting role to play in understanding our relationship to artificial intelligence, and how we don't really understand it. And that is because of a sort of structural incompleteness about knowledge itself.
Yeah, is film where we're doing most of our philosophical thinking about these questions, rather than in the tech, businesses and companies? Do you feel like that's kind of what's happening here?
Yes, completely. I mean, all the most interesting things I've seen about, or heard about, are coming from cinema. Maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but I haven't, read anything as interesting as some of the films, that the kind of concepts that are treated in some of the films about AI. And there's lots of obvious reasons for that, because film is a place where you can truly speculate on things that aren't currently possible. And the problem with the tech industry is that it's restricted by capitalism. It's restricted by the limitations put on the capacities of how people who are trained to work in these industries are not necessarily trained to think critically, or not necessarily trained to think philosophically. So it's a kind of like very divided world, I think. And I think it would benefit from a lot more kind of interdisciplinary humanities, and people working really on the question of what is the human in these places. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much Lacan deals with this subject, but I'm more of a fan of Jung. That's at least my knowledge set comes from. And I've always thought about what's taking place a lot right now in our film and in our storytelling is what I would call like shadow projection, right? Where we've kind of repressed the parts of ourselves that we don't accept, that society doesn't talk about. Maybe that's something like sex, and we project it into our stories and kind of put it out there in the world so that we can attack it and learn about it. And really what we're doing is we're trying to learn about ourselves by taking that part of ourselves that we don't accept and making it part of the world around us. I don't know, is that something that you look at all in your field of psychoanalysis? And is that something that you feel is happening with our stories and with our film? Is that we're trying to have that dialogue with ourselves in that kind of external way?
Absolutely. I mean, the sort of psychoanalysis in film theory has a very long, rich history of really looking at the ways that film has this capacity to ask questions about humanity, to ask philosophical questions, and to without being explicit, without being didactic, or without sort of trying to explain difficult concepts. Film has a way of showing the concept, has a way of situating you in sort of positions that you would never be able to be in, not just dramatically or emotionally, but also logically. There are ways to portray what it is to be a human body, how to move through space and time, how to accelerate, decelerate the process of growing and aging, and all of these things that film can do allow us to kind of experiment with sci-fi. And actually, artificial intelligence is just as much a product of sci-fi as it is of actual scientific development. In fact, you could say, well, it is sci-fi. It only ever came from sci-fi. If it wasn't for narrative and story and fantasy, we wouldn't have artificial intelligence at all. And that's actually where it did grow from. All the different fantasies that people have had throughout the ages about the idea of the automaton or the idea of the alien. The idea of recreating a monster. These are all science fiction. These are all fantasy.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of switching gears a little bit here, that just got me thinking, as we do push forward with this technology, do you think our language is going to update? You were talking about before, I think you were basically alluding to the fact that words try to capture something that's ephemeral and abstract and put it in this little tiny box, and there's always going to be something lost. And I'm wondering if we have something like AI, or we have things like people changing genders in avatars and games, or being on social media and being able to pretend to be a different gender or sex. Do these kind of technological changes, you think, update the psychoanalytical field? Does it update our understanding and maybe improve it by giving us new language to talk about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think another part of the book, important to say, is that actually it's not just sort of interrogating artificial intelligence and sort of slapping its wrist. It's the opposite way as well applies. It's to put psychoanalysis in the position of having to update itself as well, to deal with the new types of human being, to do with the new challenges of technology, and to move psychoanalysis along with conceptual and philosophical changes as well, in the way that we talk about human bodies, for example. No discourse is immune from needing to refresh itself. And one of the motivations for writing the book was that I was actually very much engaged with clinical psychoanalysis and learning about the clinic and training with clinicians. So when I was hearing all of the kind of clinical changes in the way that they were updating their sort of nosological diagnostic categories in how they're thinking about the contemporary subject, I was struck by the way that it was really fascinating and really interesting how psychoanalysis has had to move along with civilizational changes in the way that they diagnose and the way that they treat. Or, in psychoanalysis, we don't talk about curing people or making people happy. It's a little bit more skeptical than that on the possibility of human happiness, but essentially how to orient the analysis, because the orientation in psychoanalysis is the cure, sorry, I should say, is oriented along the lines of the structure of subjectivity. And this has a history going back to Freud, etc. But essentially what was being noticed was that human beings were organizing themselves in various different ways, and they weren't, and it was important to recognize this in order to efficiently deal with the way that humans experience trauma and experience their bodies and experience what we would put in inverted commas madness, because of course madness for psychoanalysis is again a term that we don't use, because there isn't such a thing as madness, as everybody's mad to a greater or lesser degree. So because of this, I felt that psychoanalysis needed to also engage with contemporary trends in critical theory and philosophy. People like, for example, Jean Baudrillard, Francois Lyotard, Friedrich Kittler, people who were talking about technology and things like AI and simulation in the future, and were sort of post-Lacanian thinkers. And I found that this clinical development needed to refresh itself in step with these kind of these trends that had been happening over the last 20 to 30 years. So, yes, the fact that technology is changing our bodies, the fact that our bodies can now have the opportunity to change more when we want them to, means that psychoanalysis has to move along in step with that as well.
Yeah, and do you think we're gonna have a lot about ourselves revealed in maybe better or worse ways? And for instance, I think of I wonder with something like a sex bot, are we gonna see things like Schadenfreude, where like people are taking pleasure from abusing these sex bots in the same way people take pleasure, it seems sometimes, in yelling angrily at their Siri or at their, Echo, or at the personal assistant AI that's in their house? Like, do you think there's potential that, I guess, our consciousness could be shifting in negative ways as we respond to the ability to have almost like a, for lack of a better word, almost like a slave?
Well, absolutely. But the thing is that human beings are already doing that now. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, human beings have been treating other human beings like slaves and continue to treat them like slaves, even now, even when slavery is not legal. So, there are many ways that this is pervasive, sexism, racism, xenophobia, all of the horrible things about human beings are obviously just going to continue in our relationship to artificial intelligence. That's undoubted. And on the question of the sex bot or the sex robot, yeah, of course they're going to be used as objects of abuse, just as women are now. In the sex industry, women are used to be as objects of abuse all the time. Just people don't talk about it in polite society, but that is that is what human beings do. So the idea that they wouldn't do that also to things that they believe are not human, or they're probably nicer to their robots because they don't want to damage them. That's the thing, that it costs money.
Well, I guess that's my question, is like, do you think technology or like an embodied AI would potentially act as almost like a pressure release valve on some of these bad behaviors, give us maybe we treat each other better because we have this object that we can throw our negative behavior at? Or might it instead wire us to see people as objects in the same way we, maybe see the sex bot?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's just that's the sort of age-old question, isn't it? Is there such a thing as cathartic release that can be beneficial? And is there such a thing as taking your anger out on not a real woman, a fake woman, in order so that you don't do it to a real woman? I mean, I'm inclined to say no. But on the other hand, psychoanalysis teaches you that there is no avoiding human cruelty. There is no avoiding human desires and the complexity of sexuality and the sort of respectability of it. There is no normative sexuality. There is no right way. But of course, there is abuse. There is, violence. There is rape. There is all of these things that still exist that have this very strange relationship when it comes to actually realistically talking about what sex is. Because when you try to sort of sanitize the whole of sex, and what you end up doing is pretending sex is something that it isn't. And that's why it's always important to, I think, psychoanalysis needs to come in much more when we talk about sexuality, because it problematizes things that we think we understand about consent, about violence, about fantasy, about all of these things that may or may not exist in different shades and degrees between people engaging in a sexual relationship. And these things are not clear, as we know they're not. And as we've seen in the last couple of decades, the sudden monumental shift when suddenly people are realizing, oh, I didn't know that wasn't okay, and men are suddenly surprised. And it's like, well, you can't really be surprised, but people will, if you live in a culture where things are accepted and it's okay, of course. But the story is more complex. It's not as simple as to say is women like this and men shouldn't do that, because what people want and what people get aren't the same thing. So I think that, yes, technology exposes all the terrible things about us and also all the amazing things about us as well. But it's important to always be critical and always to be looking at the other side of things and the unsaid things and the hidden things, which is what psychoanalysis is so great at doing, is unearthing all the terrible, scary things about humans, about culture, but also about ourselves, our own desires. What are the desires that we have that we don't act upon, or that society doesn't allow, and which of those desires we have to reckon with ethically are okay desires, but they're not accepted by society, or they really aren't good. And whether our society condones them or not, they're just bad. And this is the whole negotiation between societal ethics and psychoanalytic ethics, which is another very huge part of psychoanalysis, which is the negotiation between the subjective question of the ethical desiring subject and how that fits into the law in general and culture.
So do you have an interest in, I guess, artificial intelligence obtaining some sort of consciousness or the way that the subjective experience of the AI exists? Or is it more about the way this reflects who we are as people? Like, do you think there's something, I mean, are you excited about the potential that AI could become conscious and have these philosophical quandaries, or is that less interesting to you than for us?
I'm more interested in thinking about it because it makes us think about what thinking is. I mean, classic philosophical answer, like, it's meta. Everything is meta as far as I'm concerned. It's a way of asking different questions and new questions. So in a sense, I'm kind of less interested in the kind of actual real development of AI as it is now. People send me all the time the latest things that's happening in AI research. And I'm really glad that people do, because it's nice. But at the same time, I'm like, the latest horror story about what an AI is doing, I sort of think it's interesting, but it's kind of always still stuck within this paradigm of kind of surveillance, for example, or the kind of administration of desire and how it all becoming, completely detached from each other and all these kind of very familiar tropes. But, one day something will happen and we will go, oh my God, shit, this is interesting. And there's a new question to be had. There are new ideas. And that's why I find film fascinating, because it makes you go, oh my God. And it doesn't have to be AI, for example, like the film Arrival with, it's Denis Villeneuve, isn't it? And Amy Adams. And when she encounters a different species and she has to understand, because she's a linguist, and she has to try to work out what this strange language they're speaking is, which is only via ink symbols. And she eventually realizes they operate in a whole different spatio-temporal dimension to her. And that film is so amazing to me because it makes you think different questions about human beings and about encountering different forms of thoughts. So this is what I'm really interested in, and this so, but it's just because AI is one of those places that you can find those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Looking forward, what would you, I guess, to offer up as guidance to either individuals who are just interested in this subject or developers of artificial intelligence? What are some of the main ideas that you really want to get people thinking about with this book as they think about where we're going in this future?
I mean, I think, first of all, the question of, subjectivity, the question of the body, the question of speech, the question of enjoyment, and how we've got to, before we start thinking about what artificial intelligence is, we have to start thinking about what human intelligence is. And that brings with it, all of the philosophical problems that arise when you realize that the human being is not just a biological entity, it's not just a scientifically observable entity, it's something much more difficult and complicated than that. And, psychoanalysis, one of the key sort of contributions to knowledge, as it were, that psychoanalysis does, is to ask the question, what would a science be that contains psychoanalysis within it? So Lacan was really interested in trying to figure out how psychoanalysis fit within the sciences, because Freud was obsessed with trying to make psychoanalysis fit with certain sciences of his day, and he was really interested in the sort of intricacies of the sort of human organism. And through that, he came about understanding that actually there was this thing called, the body that didn't necessarily respond to science in the way that the sciences at the time wanted it to. Hence the discovery of the, Freud's discovery of the hysteric symptom was the beginning of psychoanalysis, which was women who experienced bodily symptoms that could not be explained by the medical sciences of the day. hence, the talking cure. Freud started to speak to these women and find out, listening to their stories and listening to their words and their, narrative about what was it that was haunting them. And ultimately, these were sexual questions. And when I say sexual, I don't just mean, just actual sex. I mean the sort of structural question of sexuality as a problem for human beings. And he discovered that this was something that couldn't be captured by science. It was something that needed psychoanalysis as well to understand how the subject fits into scientific discourse and how we factor in this kind of blind spot of subjectivity. And so Lacan took that idea to the nth degree, and he worked through all kinds of philosophical thinkers and philosophers of science, epistemologists, to kind of understand this question. And it's such a complicated one, but he goes back to Descartes. He goes through Plato. He goes through Pascal. He goes through Shakespeare. He goes through linguistics, structural anthropology, poetry. He uses all these resources to try and think about what is this? How do we fit this into the sciences? How do we fit this speaking subject into the sciences? So what I would say is that people need to read more Lacan, but not just Lacan. People need to understand that all of these things are connected, and there's no one scientific way of understanding AI. And I suppose the takeaway message for this particular conversation, I guess, would be, because you're in the AI industry, I guess, and that is a place where science dominates. And so I guess it would be to say that science needs to be less complacent about its place within epistemological advancement of human knowledge.
Yeah, maybe a little less reductionism.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up on time here, and I want to respect yours, Isabel. So any closing thoughts or words or anything you want to promote or tell people about? Obviously, we'll link to the book, but anything you're working on or want to share?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, obviously the book is The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, and I'm sure you'll put the link in that's available. And I'm working on my next book, which is called Pattaya Politics, and that will be out with Bloomsbury next year. So yeah, all my stuff can be found on my website, videos and talks with lots of interesting people as well. So yeah, be good to see if people can merge these thoughts with more kind of like industry-led ideas. That will be interesting to see.